There are moments in high school that live in whispers. A glance exchanged across a hallway. A tray dropped in the cafeteria. A name that carries power not because it's earned, but because no one dares to question it. Westbridge High had its own king, and his name was Chase Donovan. He didn't wear a crown, but he didn't need to. His confidence was his armor, his smirk a signature. The halls seemed to part for him, his word law among the varsity jackets and Letterman-laced hierarchy of suburban Texas youth. Nobody told him no. Nobody dared. That changed the day Ellie Monroe walked through the front doors. She didn't look like a storm. She didn't move like one either. Quiet, reserved, and carrying nothing but a worn-out backpack and the kind of silence that people mistook for weakness. She blended into the crowd like water slipping between fingers, almost invisible, almost forgettable. But Chase noticed her, and that was his first mistake. No one remembered exactly how it started. Maybe a shoulder bump, a dropped notebook, a hallway encounter that should have passed without consequence. But Chase, being who he was, saw an opportunity. He laughed too loud. He leaned in too close. He assumed she was like everyone else. She wasn't. At first, Ellie didn't flinch. She didn't respond, and that more than anything unnerved him. Because bullies don't know what to do with silence. They feed on fear, on reaction, on the ability to twist discomfort into dominance. Ellie gave him nothing. That afternoon, something happened that would turn Westbridge High inside out. As students poured out of the building into the golden haze of a Dallas sunset, Ellie stood alone at the curb, still composed, unreadable. Then with a roar that seemed to shake the sidewalk, a sleek black Camaro pulled up beside her. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The window rolled down slowly, revealing a man whose face didn't need introduction, Dwayne DJ Monroe. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Ellie stepped in without looking back. By the time the car disappeared down the road, 100 questions hung in the air like smoke. Who was she? Why was he here? And what did that mean for the social order that had always seemed untouchable? By Monday morning, the rules had changed. Some just didn't know it yet. The morning Ellie Monroe arrived at Westbridge High, the sky above Dallas was a smooth canvas of pale blue, broken only by the quiet drifting of early autumn clouds. The air still held the edge of lingering summer heat thick enough to bead sweat along her neck as she stepped off the school bus and adjusted the fraying straps of her backpack. She paused for a moment at the bottom of the front steps, eyes fixed on the school's wide brick entrance framed by banners promoting football tryouts and homecoming week. Around her, groups of students clustered in familiar circles, laughing, talking, jostling each other, like they had known each other for years, which in most cases they had. Ellie didn't slow her breath or square her shoulders. She just moved forward, careful not to make too much eye contact, just another face in a sea of them. It wasn't her first transfer. In 3 years, she'd learned that starting over meant shrinking, keeping quiet, figuring out where not to sit, who not to talk to, what kind of silence to wear so it wouldn't look like loneliness. Every school had a different rhythm, but the rules were always the same. Power walked in packs. Cruelty came with a smile, and attention was never your friend. Inside, the hallways buzzed with the chaotic symphony of lockers slamming shut and sneakers squeaking across linoleum floors. Ellie navigated it all with practiced ease, eyes low pace, steady, posture neutral. She stopped only long enough to check her schedule, already memorizing where she'd need to sit, which direction to move when the bell rang, and which faces carried that dangerous, effortless confidence that marked social royalty. That's when she noticed him. Chase Donovan stood at the center of the corridor, a gravitational pull in human form. Surrounded by his entourage athletes in matching jackets, girls with polished laughter, he leaned against the lockers like he owned the walls themselves. His posture was relaxed, his grin casually cruel, his eyes scanning the crowd for something to own, something to dominate. Ellie recognized him instantly. Every school had one, the golden boy, untouchable, adored, and feared. She made a mental note: avoid him. Stay small. Stay unnoticed. But the hallway had other plans. A deliberate shoulder bump sent her books scattering across the floor. She crouched down, already aware of the stares, the suppressed laughter, the static charge in the air as the game began. She didn't look up. She didn't react. She simply gathered her things with quiet, mechanical precision and kept walking. No anger, no fear, just distance. By the end of first period, she had already mapped escape routes. By lunch, she had found the quiet corner of the cafeteria that offered visibility without exposure. By final bell, she had memorized where Chase's circle moved, how loud they got, who they mocked, and when. Ellie wasn't afraid. She was calculating. And if Chase thought she was just another target, then he hadn't learned one very important truth. Some storms don't arrive with thunder. Some slip in quietly and wait. By the second morning, the school had already begun folding Ellie Monroe into its social fabric, not as someone known, but as someone watched. She had become part of the background noise, a new variable in the equation of hallway dynamics. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with indifference. But one pair of eyes saw something else. Chase Donovan noticed patterns, not in books or numbers, but in power. He'd learned early that authority in high school wasn't given. It was taken, enforced, reinforced. Every nod he received, every nervous laugh, every cleared path in the hallway was part of a machine he'd spent years perfecting. And someone walking past that machine without acknowledging it, that caught his attention. He saw her again outside room 203, standing by a locker she barely used. Eyes down, presence ghost-like. A shadow with weight. A girl who didn't look lost, but also didn't ask for direction. He watched her more than once, studying how she moved like she'd already memorized the building. She didn't trip or stutter. She didn't sit near anyone. She made herself invisible but not forgettable. That for Chase was a challenge. He didn't confront her in the open. Not yet. He toyed with the idea first. The accidental shoulder nudge had been a test, a push to see how easily she broke. But she hadn't cracked. She hadn't flinched. And worse, she hadn't given him the one thing he always got, a reaction. The hallway had gone quiet for just a breath too long that day. Just enough for people to notice the moment. The tension. The fact that she didn't crumble. And that more than anything irritated him. Chase didn't like silence unless he was the one commanding it. He started small comments passed under breath books, nudged off desks, a subtle campaign of undermining. His friends followed suit. One bumped into her at lunch. Another tipped a water bottle near her backpack. But every time she responded the same way, steady, detached, untouched. It wasn't that she didn't see them coming. It was that she let them come and passed through like wind through a broken door. He began to notice something else too. Others were watching not just him, but her. With each failed attempt to rattle her, Chase could feel control slipping. Laughter that once came so easily around him began to feel forced. His friends, once loyal by instinct, started glancing around before joining in. The power he'd worn like a crown had started to feel like weight. Ellie never retaliated. She never raised her voice. But her silence was no longer passive. It had become confrontational in its own right, a mirror that reflected everything ugly back at him. Chase didn't understand it yet. But something about her was different. And deep down, buried beneath the bravado, he felt it something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not hate, not rage, but threat. The air that afternoon was heavy with the kind of heat that clings to skin and turns pavement into shimmer. School let out in its usual storm doors, flung open voices, rising cars, pulling in and out of the loop like a steady breath. Ellie Monroe stood near the curb, her shadow long against the concrete, motionless in the chaos of movement. She had known something was coming. Chase Donovan wasn't the kind of person to walk away from silence. He needed confirmation, dominance, applause. And Ellie hadn't given him any of those. That meant he would escalate. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. From behind her, a group of voices rose, familiar ones. Laughter wrapped in cruelty, steps heavier than casual. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The tension in the air had already announced him. And still she didn't flinch. Instead, she shifted her weight, pulling her phone from her pocket with slow, deliberate ease. The screen glowed briefly beneath her thumb. One press, one signal. A low growl echoed down the street. Students turned, drawn to the sound before they even saw it. A black Chevrolet Camaro swept around the corner, its engine a sharp contrast to the muted suburban background. It pulled up to the curb in perfect silence, save for the rhythmic purr beneath the hood. The windows were tinted, the body polished to an obsidian sheen. It didn't belong in a school zone, and yet it fit the moment like a final piece in a puzzle. The passenger side window slid down. Inside sat Dwayne DJ Monroe. Even from the sidewalk, his presence was undeniable, calm, composed, utterly unshakable. He didn't wave. He didn't gesture. He didn't need to. Ellie stepped forward, backpack slung over one shoulder, her pace unhurried. She didn't glance behind her. She didn't need to see the faces. She could already feel the weight of their stares, the sudden drop in temperature, the electric stillness that comes when a script is torn in half. She opened the door, slid inside, and shut it behind her without a word. The Camaro peeled away, its departure as clean and decisive as its arrival. Left in its wake stood a crowd of stunned students, and at the center, Chase Donovan, suddenly very small beneath the weight of something he didn't understand. He had tried to humiliate her. Instead, she'd rewritten the rules of the game. No grand speeches, no shouting match, just precision, just presence. And in that single moment, Ellie Monroe became something new in their eyes, not a victim, not a mystery, a reckoning. By the next morning, Westbridge High had changed. It hadn't happened through an announcement or a fight. There were no videos, no viral posts. Just murmurs threaded into locker conversations, whispered over cafeteria tables, passed like static through glances and half-finished sentences. Ellie Monroe had arrived in silence, and then she'd stepped into a black Camaro. Now everyone wanted to know who she was. Some thought she was famous. Others assumed she was dangerous. But all agreed on one thing: she was no longer invisible. And to Chase Donovan, that made her unacceptable. Power doesn't vanish quietly, especially when it belongs to someone who believes it's permanent. Chase walked into school with a tension in his stride that hadn't been there before. His friends tried to carry on the usual routine, loud jokes, casual dominance, but even they seemed to pause between laughs, their eyes flicking toward Ellie whenever she passed. She didn't speak. She didn't gloat. She didn't even look at them. That only made it worse. Chase began testing her again, this time with more pressure. A bump that nearly knocked her books into a puddle. A tipped-over tray in the cafeteria. A locker door accidentally slammed shut against her hand. Each time, Ellie responded the same way. No outburst, no confrontation. She would pause, assess, reset. Quiet, composed, and somehow more threatening than if she'd screamed. She didn't play his game, so Chase escalated. By Thursday, whispers had turned to stares. His jokes fell flat. People watched how Ellie moved, how she held herself. She became less a target, more a question, and Chase hated unanswered questions. At lunch, the shift reached a boiling point. Ellie took her usual seat alone near the back wall, eyes scanning the room, always aware. A few students nearby snuck glances her way, waiting to see what Chase might try next. He didn't disappoint. Dean, one of Chase's biggest followers, a linebacker with the subtlety of a freight train, moved across the cafeteria in a slow arc. As Ellie walked toward the trash bin, his foot stretched out just far enough. Her sneaker caught the edge tray, tipping forward. But Ellie caught herself. In one smooth motion, she regained her balance, her tray barely clattering. She turned slightly, gave Dean the faintest smile, and returned to her seat. The laughter that followed didn't belong to Chase's crew. It came from the tables around them. Students who had once watched in silence were now watching in amusement and not at Ellie. The illusion was cracking. And once an audience stops believing in the act, the performer loses his grip. Chase clenched his jaw but said nothing. Not yet. After the final bell, Ellie found her locker vandalized. The door swung open, her books scattered across the floor, graffiti scribbled in thick marker words that tried too hard to wound messages meant to humiliate. She stood there for a long second, unmoving. A few students lingered nearby, watching with hushed anticipation. Ellie didn't cry, she didn't call a teacher, she didn't even clean up right away. She just breathed. Then she knelt one by one, collecting her things, wiping off the words without haste, without expression. She closed the locker, gently slung her backpack over her shoulder, and walked away like nothing had happened. The silence she left behind was deafening. That night, the kitchen light cast soft shadows across the marble countertops in her home. DJ leaned against the edge, arms crossed, watching her. Ellie sat at the table, tapping her fingers in rhythm to a silent thought. She told him what had happened. He didn't respond with anger, only curiosity. Ellie wasn't looking for revenge. She was watching the slow unraveling of a system. She knew Chase would keep pushing, But she also knew something Chase hadn't figured out yet. Every move he made was being observed, not just by her, but by the very people he once ruled. And they were growing tired. Friday brought more tension, more eyes. Ellie walked into the building like she always did, steady, composed, a phantom dressed in certainty. But now every step she took left ripples. Her classmates were split. Some admired her. Others feared what was coming. A few still clung to Chase, but even they began to hesitate. Power, when questioned, becomes fragile. And Chase had never been questioned like this before. He tried one more stunt during lunch. A loud taunt from across the cafeteria, mocking sharp design to trigger. Ellie didn't rise to it. She didn't flinch. She just took her seat unfazed. And when the crowd turned to her instead of him, Chase's control fractured a little more. He was unraveling and everyone could see it. But Ellie didn't need them to see it yet. She needed him to feel it first. She let the tension rise, let the social fabric stretch under its own pressure. And in that space between confrontation and collapse, she waited calm, unshaken, and always one step ahead. Because Chase Donovan hadn't just picked the wrong girl. He'd picked the one who didn't need to fight to win. He just hadn't realized it yet. By the following week, the energy at Westbridge High had shifted in ways too subtle to name but too loud to ignore. What had once been a school ruled by a single center of gravity had fractured into orbiting doubts. Students who once moved in perfect sync with Chase Donovan's presence now looked over their shoulders. Their laughter came with caution. Their steps carried hesitation. Ellie Monroe hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't rallied anyone to her side. She simply existed in a space where Chase's power no longer applied, and in doing so, she redefined the rules of engagement. Every day she walked the same halls, quiet and alert, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. But now the silence that once cloaked her had transformed into armor. She didn't avoid Chase anymore. She passed him, met his gaze, held it just long enough to let him know she wasn't afraid. And that made him furious. He tried to bait her again, words flung in public calculated to sting, designed to provoke. The cafeteria became a stage, the audience on edge. Chase mocked, postured, pushed, but Ellie never reacted. Instead, she allowed him to keep pressing more loudly, more carelessly. And as he reached, he overreached. His jabs, once received as humor, now echoed as desperation. His tone turned harsher. His followers, once eager to echo his cruelty, began exchanging uncertain glances. Ellie didn't need to retaliate. She let Chase do the damage for her. She watched him falter, subtle at first. A joke that didn't land. A smirk that drew no laughter. A glare that was returned with disinterest. The image he had crafted, confident, untouchable, adored, was unraveling thread by thread. And he was the one pulling the string. Then came the tipping point. 2 days later, the school buzzed before the first bell even rang. Students huddled in corners, phones glowing, eyes wide. Something had happened overnight. Something big. Ellie stepped through the front doors and immediately knew. Chase's locker stood at the center of it all. Paper covered the metal. Printed screenshots, blown-up text bubbles, time-stamped chats, DMs, comments. Everything he had ever said about his teammates, his teachers, his so-called friends was now public. Vile jokes, cruel takedowns, casual hate disguised as sarcasm. His entire inner world laid bare for all to see. Some messages were weeks old, others were days. None could be denied. He arrived moments later, already sensing the shift. He pushed through the crowd, jaw-tight eyes scanning the damage. Then he froze. There it was, his kingdom burning in silence. And in the distance, Ellie leaned against the opposite locker, arms folded, gaze steady. She didn't speak. She didn't smirk. She didn't move. She didn't have to, because Chase Donovan had built his empire on intimidation and illusion. Now, with the mask ripped away, there was nothing left to shield him from the truth. His friends stepped back. Not all at once, but enough to matter. Enough to make him feel the weight of absence. Students who once laughed at his jokes now stared with something closer to disgust or worse, apathy. He turned, searching for a response that might save him, but there were none. Ellie had played the long game. Not with fists, not with fury, but with patience, with clarity, with silence sharp enough to cut deeper than any insult. In the days that followed, she watched the social hierarchy realign itself. Not around her, but away from him. She never claimed his throne. She never wanted it. She just broke the illusion that kept it standing. And in doing so, she became something Chase had never been: respected. The silence that had once followed Ellie Monroe now trailed Chase Donovan instead. In the days after the exposure, he walked the halls of Westbridge High like a ghost in a kingdom he no longer ruled. His presence, once magnetic, now pulled nothing but glances laced with caution, whispers sharpened by judgment. The sway he'd relied on, those nods, those fist bumps, those half-laughs from classmates who used to orbit his influence, had dissolved like fog in the morning sun. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. The reign was over. The printed screenshots had done more than embarrass him. They'd stripped away the myth. What had once been seen as confidence was now clearly cruelty. What passed as charm revealed itself as control. Even the ones who had laughed alongside him couldn't justify what was on paper. They saw the messages, the manipulation. The venom slipped behind their backs while Chase smiled to their faces, and they turned away. Bit by bit, the empire he'd built with smirks and fear cracked beneath his own weight. Friends stopped waiting for him in the parking lot. Lunch tables that once made room for him now filled without hesitation. Teachers watched him more closely. Students watched him less. Ellie didn't need to do anything more. She simply continued as she had from the start, quiet, composed, unbothered. She never claimed victory. She never gloated. She didn't change her seat at lunch or start walking differently through the hallways. And that infuriated Chase more than anything. He tried to reset the game. Tried to bark louder, walk taller, pretend none of it mattered. But every time he opened his mouth, the air around him cooled. The room stiffened. The looks that met his were no longer admiring. They were wary, disappointed, cold. His anger festered without an outlet. And when anger has no place to go, it turns inward. Ellie saw it in the way he moved. Less swagger, more strain. His shoulders hunched tighter. His eyes flinched more often. He watched her not as a threat, but as a reminder. Every time she entered the room, his mask faltered. Every time someone smiled at her, or worse, ignored him, his composure slipped another inch. She had become gravity, and he a man floating without anchor. One afternoon, he stood in the hallway staring at his locker. The taped remnants from the earlier scandal had long been torn down, but the shadow of it still lingered. He reached for the handle, then stopped, as if even the act of opening it had become too heavy. Students walked past him, not around him. No one stopped. No one stepped aside. No one cared. Ellie approached from the far end of the hallway, her steps, even her face, unreadable. Their eyes met, and in that moment everything that had once been flipped. The fear he had cultivated now lived behind his own eyes. The control he once wielded now slipped through trembling fingers, and she didn't even blink. She passed him without pause, leaving behind nothing but stillness. For the first time, Chase didn't follow. He didn't speak. He didn't smirk. He simply stood there surrounded by everything he had once owned and now had no power to move. The weight of his own actions crushed what remained. The students of Westbridge didn't cheer. They didn't chant. They didn't need to. Because the fall of a king built on fear doesn't come with applause. It comes with silence, and silence had never been louder. The end didn't come with chaos. It came quietly. There was no final confrontation in the middle of a crowd, no viral video, no dramatic suspension, just an empty chair in the cafeteria, a hallway that no longer made space, and the absence of a voice that used to echo louder than any bell. By Monday, Chase Donovan had become background noise. He still came to school at first, still walked through the front doors like he was entitled to be noticed. But fewer heads turned. Fewer eyes met his. The looks he received now weren't of admiration or envy, they were avoidance. The kind of glances people give to things they no longer fear, but no longer respect. His locker stayed untouched, not out of reverence, but indifference. The crowds he once commanded dissolved. His followers disbanded not with rebellion, but with quiet exits. One by one, they returned to the spaces they had abandoned for his attention. And without them, Chase was just another student, barely that. Ellie watched the collapse from a distance, not because she needed validation, but because she understood something most didn't power rarely shatters all at once. It crumbles slowly, layer by layer, until even the one who once held it starts to question if he ever had it at all. She noticed the small things first. The way he lingered outside classrooms too long pretending to check his phone. The way his hands fidgeted during lectures. The way his laughter sounded different, more forced, shorter ending before anyone else joined in. He sat alone now, not by choice. And still, she never spoke to him, never cornered him, never gloated. Because the point was never to win. It was to end the harm. She had given him nothing, and in that void he had revealed himself. The real Chase, without audience, without influence, was not a threat. He was just a boy who didn't know who he was without control. The day he stopped showing up to school, no one noticed right away. It wasn't an announcement. It wasn't discussed in hushed tones. He simply disappeared like a storm that had passed through and left nothing but gray skies and dry ground behind. Ellie sat at her usual table near the back of the cafeteria, just like she always had. She ate her lunch without glancing around. There was no crown, no throne, no declaration of victory. Just peace and presence. A few students nodded as they passed. A few more sat at nearby tables, not close enough to crowd her, but no longer afraid to be near. The distance around her had softened not through conquest, but through quiet understanding. Outside, the Texas sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. The Camaro waited at the curb, its engine humming in the background of a school now returned to equilibrium. Ellie stepped out into the light, her bag slung over one shoulder, her gaze level with the horizon. The balance had been restored, not by fighting fire with fire, but by letting the fire burn itself out. She had never wanted to be noticed, but by refusing to be broken, she had made herself unforgettable. Not feared, not followed, but respected. And in a place where fear had once ruled the halls, that alone was a revolution. Time passed, and the story of Ellie Monroe faded from daily gossip into quiet legacy. No one spoke about it directly anymore. There were no commemorative plaques, no assemblies, no nods in yearbooks. But something fundamental had shifted inside the walls of Westbridge High, something that couldn't be measured in detentions or demerits. It lived in the small moments. A sophomore choosing not to laugh at someone else's expense. A hallway that felt less tense. A cafeteria where no one ruled the room. People didn't point to Ellie when they made kinder choices. They didn't use her name to justify being better. But her presence lingered in the way students walked with more confidence, in how silence no longer meant vulnerability, and in how authority was no longer confused with intimidation. She never became popular. She never tried, but her quiet resistance carved new pathways, not just for herself, for others. In the weeks following Chase Donovan's fall, students began reclaiming the spaces he once occupied. The corner tables were filled with unfamiliar faces. The back rows in class no longer belonged to whispers and manipulation. The school, once tightly wound around fear and flattery, began to breathe again. Ellie didn't insert herself into any of it. She watched, observed, learned, and in doing so continued her quiet campaign, not against anyone, but in favor of balance, of presence, of being unshakable without needing to shout. Outside of school, life continued with its own rhythm. The Camaro still waited at the curb most afternoons. DJ leaned casually against the driver's side, nodding at teachers watching Ellie with the proud, restrained warmth of someone who knew the value of stillness. At home, she moved through routines with the calm focus of someone who no longer carried the weight of proving anything. Her evenings were spent in books, not revenge. Her mornings started with quiet preparation, not anticipation of survival. She had never needed power. She had needed space, and now she had it. The lesson wasn't in the downfall of the bully, it was in the refusal to break. In choosing not to match cruelty with cruelty. In allowing truth to take shape through patience. What made Ellie formidable wasn't her strength, it was her steadiness. Her silence was never submission, it was strategy. And long after the noise died down, that silence remained echoing louder than any insult, more lasting than any shout. The final trace of Chase Donovan faded the day a new student entered Westbridge, looking lost and unsure, clutching a schedule like a lifeline. Ellie saw it from across the hallway. She didn't offer a wave or an introduction. She simply stepped aside, made room, and moved on. That was her way. No spotlight, no fanfare, just quiet, unwavering dignity. She never needed to be the loudest. She just needed to remain. And that, more than anything, was what changed everything, not by rising above others, but by never sinking to meet them. In the end, Ellie Monroe didn't win by conquering anyone. She won by refusing to be conquered. Her journey through Westbridge High wasn't about revenge, reputation, or even recognition. It was about endurance, about holding her ground in a world that expected her to flinch. She never raised her voice, never struck back, never chased applause. Instead, she let truth speak through her silence, and that silence dismantled a throne built on fear. Chase Donovan's fall wasn't dramatic because Ellie exposed him. It was dramatic because he exposed himself. Every cruel message, every petty act, every desperate attempt to maintain control revealed a truth far more powerful than any confrontation. Those who depend on fear for power are already standing on fragile ground. And when no one is afraid anymore, that ground disappears beneath them. Ellie taught her school something no speech could convey. Real strength isn't loud. It's steady. It's patient. It's quiet when quiet needs to be loudest. Her silence wasn't empty. It was full of intent, and it forced the world around her to shift. She didn't become the queen of Westbridge. She became its mirror. And in her reflection, a generation of students learned to stand taller, speak less cruelly, and question what kind of power they admired. Because sometimes the strongest revolution is not to rise, but to remain unmoved.